Hello and welcome to the dungeon. I'm your host Rob, and today we're going to be looking at something called Dungeon Crawl Classics. It's not quite D&D, but it's very similar. And if you look at some of the interior art, it has a very old school, original D&D type look and feel to it. And that's because it's based on the original Dungeons and Dragons. It's part of what's called the OSR, standing for Old School Renaissance, or Old School Revolution. I've sometimes heard it called, but I like Renaissance. The whole idea of the OSR is that people have taken basically like the basic set and expert set type rules, or even advanced Dungeons and Dragons like first and second edition type rules, and then just built their own games from it. And people have come up with some really creative, strange, and innovative games. In fact, some of the more interesting and exciting things happening in the hobby right now are all coming out of the old school Renaissance. And one of the reasons for this is because people have been able to basically create almost anything, it turns out, using the original core rules as a rough framework. And people have built on and expanded it and taken it from in all sorts of different places. We have like science fiction games built on it. We have like mutant type games, like post-apocalyptic Fallout type things. Just everything you can imagine, like historical games, like Lion and Dragon, for example, which are all based on, like 14th century England and Europe, essentially. And from this, we've gotten a lot of really cool products. I've also been kind of incorporating some of this even into my current 5e campaign. One game called Lamentations of the Flame Princess, I've stolen a couple of their different adventures, most notably Death Frost Doom, which is an excellent horror type story. And I essentially just rewrote it and converted a lot of things to make it fit into my current campaign world. And I also I wouldn't say that I stole it, but was definitely inspired by a different product of theirs called A Red and Pleasant Land, which is like a combination of Dracula meets Alice in Wonderland. And I really liked that idea, but theirs was a little heavy on the whimsical Alice side and not enough on the gothic horror vampire Dracula side. So I was took some of their ideas and just did it my own way. But a lot of these kind of weird, cool ideas are all coming out of just independent companies right now that are all making some really interesting things. But I'm not here to talk about all the rest of them. I'm here to talk about this one. So for anybody who has heard of Dungeon Crawl Classics, they've probably heard about the level 0 funnel, since that seems to be one of the things the game is best known for. But for those of you who haven't, I will begin by talking about that. Unlike, say, Dungeons & Dragons or most other type of games, the players do not get to choose their class right away. You start as a level 0 peasant or serf or escaped slave or what have you, and you essentially are worthless. Like you have almost no skills. You probably don't have a weapon, or if you do, it's because you were like a grave digger in your previous profession, so now you have a shovel, or you were a blacksmith, so you have a blacksmith's hammer. Maybe you're lucky and you have a shield or something, but most people will have one random piece of equipment, which could just be like an arm plate for one arm. You might not have anything useful at all. And that's part of what makes the game cool. You roll your stats, old style. 3 dice 6, none of this 4 dice 6, drop the lowest or anything. And all the stats are rolled in order. So you could easily have a strength of 4 or 5 or an intelligence of 3 or whatever. And I really kind of like that feel to the game as well. It just makes for some horrible, awful characters. But that's really where the fun comes in. The level 0 funnel is basically the idea that you're going to have 14, 15, 16 player characters all trying to do the dungeon together at once. And every player just plays enough characters to bring your party total up to an acceptable level. And then you just go from there. And the death rate is pretty horrific because all your level 0 characters have die 4 hit points. You can get killed by pretty much anything in one shot. You may have some stamina bonuses for your hit points, but you may have a penalty for all you know. And you have a randomly determined occupation. You begin with one weapon and training in its use, possession of a random trade good, and everybody has a +0 to their attack and damage unless it's modified by their strength score. So the idea is that with 15 or 16 characters, once most of them have died off, whoever manages to survive, that will form your party. And once you hit level 1, then you can choose a class. Very similar to old school like red box set. Like if you're as old as me, you probably remember the basic set in the red box. If you're older, you might remember even whatever came before that. I think it was a brown box or something. But I started with the red box back in like 81 or 82. And back then, things like elves and dwarves and halflings weren't just your race, that was also your class. And this game actually follows that same logic. If you're a halfling, you're not a halfling thief, you're not a halfling fighter, you're not a halfling wizard, you are a halfling. And same with dwarves, same with elves, etc. One interesting thing that this game uses as well is called the dice chain. It uses all the regular dice you'd expect from D&D, but also uses a bunch of really strange, kind of unique dice, like a D3, D5, D7. So the dice chain goes D3, D4, D5, D6, D7, D8, D10, D12, 14, 16, 20, 24, and 30. Now apparently you can buy a lot of these specialty dice off like Amazon, and apparently it's fairly cheap. But one thing that surprised me when I saw people talk about this online is that you can just simply do the dice yourself. You don't even need to have special dice. For example, if you had to roll a die 24, you can just simply roll a die 12 and then another dice to modify it and determine if it's the high or the low end of the range. So if I take some dice and I have a die 6 and there's a die 12, I can just roll. This will mean it's on the high end of the range. So I would add 12 to this and I would have a 15. If this was a 2, then that would just be a 3. And all you do is determine if it's in the low end of the range or the high end of the range. You can do the same thing with the die 16 just by using this with the die 8. And for something like a die 3, you just roll a die 6, divide it by 2, round up. So 1 or 2 is a 1, 3, 4 is a 2, 5, 6 is a 3. The die 5, you can do the same thing with the die 10, etc. Now I'm not saying don't buy special dice because they're probably pretty cool, to be honest. But any of the different combinations that they use in this game are achievable just with this type of method. The D5 can just be a D10 divided by 2, round up. Your D30, you can use a D6 and a D10. 1 or 2 means that you're in the 1 to 10 range. If you roll a 3 or 4, you add 10. 5 or 6, you add 20, giving you all the results you need between 1 and 30. Anyways, the reason for the die chain, though, is because different modifiers will not only just give you a +1 or a -2 or whatever. Sometimes it will move you up a dice size or down a dice size. So you could go from rolling a die 20 for your attack roll to a die 16 because maybe you're dual wielding. Or maybe you go to a die 24 because you have some sort of extra advantage, and that makes it even easier for you to hit the target armor class. One of the more unique things as well is the spellcasting system, which looks pretty cool. Bear in mind, I have yet to play the game, but essentially, once you are high enough level to cast spells, you only need to be level 1 if you're an elf, wizard, or a cleric. All of them get spells. Basically, nobody else gets spells. You'll roll your spells randomly, so you don't get to choose. Although they do have some optional rules because they acknowledge that rolling 4 non-combat spells does not make for a very fun wizard. So they do have the option of allowing players to disregard one of them and then choose the one they want, which is something I would probably lean towards. Because even though the death rate is horrific at level 0, and probably level 1 as well, you don't want the characters to be completely worthless. So let's say, for example, you're going to cast Flaming Hands. It'll give you all the details. It'll tell you what happens if you have a misfire, because everything has a chance of going wrong. If you roll a natural 1, then your spell is going to do something very bad. There's also a chance of corruption, and corruption can actually change the actual physical appearance of your character in different ways. and there'll be a target depending on the level of the spell. You then roll on the chart, you add all your bonuses, which will include your, say, a wizard, you'll add your intelligence modifier plus your caster level, and then it'll give you the result. One of the nice things is that you can actually get incredibly powerful spells just by casting basic spells. For example, a magic missile could be what you're familiar with in Dungeons and Dragons, where you just blast somebody with some missiles. But if you roll high enough, you could literally launch volleys of magical missiles striking anything and everything that you choose. You can also choose lower results. So for example, if you cast Fireball and get a really high result, you might launch a ton of fireballs and blast everything in an area, kind of like a meteor swarm almost. But maybe you're only fighting one powerful creature, so you don't need to blast everything in an area. One of the lower results could be that you just channel one particularly powerful bolt of fire and strike the enemy for a truckload of damage. You could then choose to do that. One of the more interesting options as well is the idea of spell burn, which allows you to sacrifice your other traits in order to make your spell more powerful. So for example, instead of just rolling your die 20 and then adding your casting bonus and your caster level, you could say, well, I have a strength of 8, and I'm going to burn off 5 points of my strength. Your strength will now go down to 3, but you'll get a +5 to that dice roll. You then have to heal up that strength at a rate of like 1 point a day, I believe it is. But it can make your spell more powerful. And I kind of like this because it kind of gives you that high risk, high reward that I really appreciate in a lot of these types of games. So you also have the option of having wizard duels and stuff where you can actually enter a different type of combat where you can use spells to try to counter enemy spells as well. And that kind of stuff is pretty cool. It really makes the spell casting feel like Magic is very interesting and very dangerous. And I think for those of us who play a lot of 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, it's kind of a nice alternative system where, you know, a fireball in D&D is always going to be a fireball. And sure, you could cast it with a 4th or 5th level spell slot, but it's still a fireball. It just does an extra 1 or 2 dice of damage. It doesn't change the spell depending on how you rolled. You can't put a portion of your physical strength or your wisdom or your stamina or whatever else into the casting of this spell in order to really try to just pour everything into one last big blast. You know, there's no Gandalf on the bridge moment where you shall not pass type thing and overachieve by taking down the Balor, or the Balrog, sorry. And I think that this kind of stuff brings a lot of interesting dynamics to the casting system, and it just makes the game look really cool and crazy and interesting. Another thing I really like are the critical hit tables, which honestly really, really remind me of Warhammer Fantasy Role-Playing for anyone who's ever played that, because it has just some really funny and crazy results. And depending on what your class and level are, you might be limited to different tables. So they actually have 5 tables of critical hits for player characters, and there's monster critical hit tables as well. So your wizard and level 0 characters can only ever get crits on the first table, but then elves and thieves can use critical hit table 2. Clerics, halflings, 1st to 2nd level warriors, and 1st to 3rd level dwarves can use table 3. And then tables 4 and 5 are only for warriors and dwarves. And you can get some pretty awesome results, like Skull Crushed Like a Melon. Inflict plus 3 die 12 damage with this strike, and the foe must make a fortitude save or die in 1 die 3 rounds. You can do things like permanently inflict brain damage on your target. You can crippling blow to the spine, inflict plus 4 die 12 damage with this strike, and the foe suffers permanent paralysis. You can get things like foe decapitated with a single strike. You are death incarnate. Continue making attacks against any foes within 10 feet of your choosing until you miss. That's pretty awesome. Strike to the weapon arm. Things like blow sunder his opponent's shield. If the opponent has no shield, they must make a fortitude save or be knocked unconscious from the pain. Opponents can be disemboweled. You can destroy somebody's face, doing permanent damage to their fellowship score, or their personality score, sorry. which is basically personality of like charisma plus willpower type of thing. You can do simple things like trip somebody or knock them down or just leave them prone. You can accidentally hit your own teammate because you go into a battle rage and do a bunch of extra damage to your target, but also kind of have it bounce off and hit one of your teammates with a glancing blow. And there's also the critical fumbles. Anytime you roll a natural 1, something bad could happen. You could drop your weapon, you could manage to somehow wound yourself, taking normal damage, you could damage your weapon and need to repair it out of combat. There's all sorts of crazy things that can happen. Another interesting aspect of the game is the idea of patrons, where wizards and clerics especially can take on different extra-dimensional beings, whether they be, angels or demons or gods of order and chaos or whatever, and they can actually get power from these beings and use them to help them cast spells, but these beings might also expect things of the character as well. So that's kind of an interesting dynamic that I think would be very interesting to see it play out. There's only 3 alignments in the game, harkening back to basic set D&D again. They have lawful, neutral, and chaotic. And that is it. And basically, everybody has to choose one of those 3 alignments. Things like clerics, especially, alignment becomes important because it's actually more difficult to heal somebody of the opposite alignment. So if you're lawful and you're healing somebody who's chaotic, it's actually more difficult to do it, and you have to roll to see if you incur disfavor or not, because your god might actually consider it rather sinful for you to be healing the creatures of evil, for example. Just like if you're an evil cleric, you're, and worship like god of death, for example, your death god might not want you healing somebody, preventing them from dying. So I think that makes some interesting stuff as well. So overall, I'm actually really looking forward to running this game. I'm still involved in my 5e campaign. The players have just hit 15th level, so we've still got a while to go on that. That one's going to run all the way to 20th level, and they'll probably be 20th level for a while too. So we still have some work there. My buddy Jaden is also running, we just call it the Waterdeep campaign. We started with Dragon Heist, and now we're on to Dungeon of the Mad Mage. So I don't want to try to step on his toes, so we'll probably try to wrap both of those things up. But I think the next campaign I run, it will be with Dungeon Crawl Classics, because it just looks like it's a crazy amount of fun. It looks kind of ridiculous and silly in some places, but it also looks just awesome. There's a lot of different types of like subgenres to it as well. There's some games I've seen with like lasers and stuff where it ends up being like the Sword and Planet type books, like the whole John Carter of Mars and all those types. There's just a million different scenarios you can use, and some of them look really funny and really hilarious. I like how there's a note in here talking about proficiency penalties and bonuses and how different classes can use whichever proficiencies, and it talks about how they don't have non-proficiency penalties on level 0 characters because they're already so terrible that the game just assumes that they're incompetent with everything, and that's part of why they're so bad. They do have a note, though, that in their beta testing, they'd experimented with giving them non-proficiency penalties if they were using a weapon that wasn't the one they'd started with, but the death rate became so catastrophic that the game became almost unplayable. The book also has a couple a couple actual adventures in the back, and the one is designed for like 15-ish player characters, but they also note that in their beta testing, they ran one party as large as 28 people at once, like 28 characters, and they still had a total party kill. TPK with 28 player characters. So I think that if people are going to take the game really seriously, this might not be the game for them. But if people can buy into the idea that you're going to be playing 3 or 4 characters and that they're all going to be, probably dead by the end of the night, and if you're lucky and have 1 or 2 surviving characters, then those will be your level 1 guys going forward, and people just kind of throw caution to the wind and just have fun with it, then I think it'd be a really great game system. there's a lot of really just strange, funny things in here to me too. Like if your strength is below 6, so 5 or under, you actually can't use two-handed weapons, and you can't use a one-handed weapon with a shield because you're so weak. You have to use your weapon with two hands, and I just find that kind of stuff really funny because it's never really an issue in Dungeons and Dragons. If your character has an intelligence of below 6, they're actually illiterate. Anybody can speak the common tongue, even if you have an intelligence of 3, you just clearly don't speak it very well. Another stat they have that I kind of like is they have luck as one of your main statistics. And you can burn luck to give yourself advantage on certain rolls, to like add bonuses and stuff. Kind of like how a wizard can burn their stats for spellcasting. And luck is actually a pretty important characteristic. One of the things you can try to do is actually recover the bodies of slain characters. So if you're in the level 0 funnel and half the party dies due to one terrible mishap, you can try to recover the bodies, and based on that character's luck score, there's a chance they might only be horrifically maimed, not actually dead. They can roll on the luck table, and if they succeed, then they only permanently lose a point of like stamina, agility, strength, or whatever, but they're still alive. So lucky them, I guess. There's all sorts of things for like broken limbs and stuff, which can affect your character. You can be just gaining and losing stats like crazy in this game, and it just seems like a really good time. So I will probably do some reviews of our game sessions once we actually start playing, but for now I think that's all I have because I haven't played it. I don't really have a lot more that I can offer. I have read through quite a bit of the book already though, and it's been an enjoyable read. I've laughed out loud many times, especially while reading through the critical hit tables, because some of the results are just hilarious. And overall, I just think it would be a really fun and interesting game. The game caps out at level 10, but it looks like experience goes really slowly towards the latter half of the game, because encounters are still only worth the same amount of experience, but you just need more and more and more experience to level. But experience points aren't really based off killing stuff, it's more just off surviving. So your party could just run away from an encounter and escape, and those of you who live will still get the experience points for that encounter, which is kind of nice. It does mean that, the halflings and dwarves with only 20 feet of movement might not make it out, but, sacrifices must be made in the level 0 funnel. Somebody has to live. All in all, it looks like a really fun game. I really like the retro art. I'm very impressed by the quality of the book itself. It's actually got a ribbon as well for a nice little bookmarker. But this thing is very, very well constructed. And you could kill somebody with this book, John Wick style. It's a hefty tome. So that's everything I have. Thanks for watching. Don't be afraid to subscribe and hit the like button, etc. And I will see you next time in the dungeon.